Robert Baratheon sat upon the Iron Throne, brooding over the state of his kingdom with a frustration that he had grown used to in the months following the Greyjoy rebellion. For all his strength, for all his boasts in the training yard and at the feasting table, the game of kingship wore on him. Each passing day, he found more reason to drink more ale, feast more heavily, and roar more loudly at small folk and lords alike. And yet, something deeper gnawed at him. With his restless spirit and his endless hunger for glory, he found himself staring often at old tomes that mentioned Valyria, that doomed empire of dragons and sorcery. In the dusty library of the Red Keep, where the air carried the scent of aged parchment and tallow candles, he read ancient accounts of the freehold's majesty and the cataclysm known as the Doom. Valyria was naught but a ruin now, they said, cursed, deathly, place no man should tread. Yet in these stories Robert found more than cautionary tales. He saw the potential for a legendary conquest that would rival even Aegon's in its audacity. He would bring glory back to Westeros, show the realm that the Baratheon name could match even the Targaryens in boldness and triumph. Reclaiming old Valyria, restoring it somehow, would stamp his legacy in the annals of history with letters of gold and rubies. He needed only the power, the men, and the cunning to do it. His advisors told him it was madness, but the more they warned him, the more his defiant heart burned. He could almost hear the clamor of steel, taste the salt of the sea, and smell the sulfur of the old flames. It was in the great hall, with the eyes of the court upon him, that Robert first spoke openly of this harebrained notion. Lords and ladies attended a feast to celebrate the end of yet another rebellion. Small wonder that the Greyjoys had not managed to rouse the Iron Islands fully again, given their losses, but it gave the king an excuse to pour out barrels of wine. Roast boar, succulent and crisp, lined the tables. Golden cups shimmered as the assembled nobles drank deeply and laughed politely at the king's bawdy jokes. And then, between bites of honey duck, Robert clapped a hand on Lord Eddard Stark's shoulder and boomed, "Ned, what think you of Valyria?" Ned Stark looked on, uncertain. He had not expected such a question. Words he might have used to chide the king for his drunkenness died in his throat. Instead, he felt compelled to speak carefully, mindful that the entire court listened. "It's a ruin, your grace," said Ned calmly. "Cursed, or so every tale I've heard claims." Robert tugged at his beard, gold-flecked from the feast's gravy. "Aye, cursed indeed, but curses can be broken, can they not? I'd sooner break a Valyrian curse than let my kingdom rot with these pitiful squabbles." Tywin Lannister, stoic even in finery, merely raised an eyebrow. Cersei, at Robert's side, observed her husband with a cool, calculating gaze. In years past, she might have attempted to flatter him, but now, she read the mood in the hall and chose to remain silent. Across the table, Stannis Baratheon's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. Renly, as ever, wore an amused smile, as though he found his elder brother's flights of fancy entertaining. Littlefinger smirked from behind his chalice, playing with one of the silver rings on his slender fingers. Varys blinked slowly, watchful in his powdery scent and perfumed silks. Unbidden, a hush spread across the hall as Robert's voice carried. "They call it the doom that destroyed Valyria," he said, pushing aside a half-eaten swan dish. "Some dread cataclysm, fires and earthquakes, but it was centuries ago, a place that once ruled half the known world. Tell me, why should we let it remain as a graveyard? Might we not plunder what's left, rebuild some corner, lay claim to an empire that even Targaryens never truly revived?" A murmur went through the crowd. Someone at the far end of the table muttered that it was folly. Another whispered about the dreaded creatures said to lurk in the smoking sea. Some said the land itself was cracked and roiling with volcanic fissures. But Robert slammed a palm on the heavy oak table, making plates jump. "Do you think me a fool? I know the dangers. Yet, I am Robert Baratheon, victor of the Trident, Stormlord, king of the Seven Kingdoms. By the gods, we have the largest host the realm has ever seen. Have we grown so timid that we quake at the mention of an ancient ruin?" Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of torches and the slow drip of molten wax from tall candles. Ned Stark's eyes flicked around. He realized Robert was deadly serious. The king had that bright, dangerous glint in his eye, a look reminiscent of the days when they rode to war against the Targaryens. Then no obstacle could stand before him. This was the same man, older and heavier though he was, who had broken Rhaegar Targaryen's chestplate with his warhammer. Gods be good, Ned thought. Robert is truly considering this madness. Eddard bowed his head. You are the king, my friend, he said softly. If this is your will, I can only counsel caution. The stories of Valyria speak of more than crumbling ruins. Dark forces. Bah! Robert snapped, though not with real anger, only impatience. Dark forces or no, I've been hearing these stories about White Walkers and Snarks since I was a boy. Not once have I laid eyes on them. I do not fear bogeymen. He looked across the hall. Stannis, you know the seas best among us. Would you sail to Valyria? Stannis stared at his older brother, coolly, lips tight as if he were tasting the bitterness on his tongue. If your grace commands it, I shall, he said. But it is my duty to warn you that no chart is reliable in that region. The smoking sea is said to churn with unnatural storms. We risk losing ships. Robert snorted. Then we build more ships. That's half the fun of it, is it not? He laughed, and a few of the lords laughed nervously with him. Enough talk. This is a feast. Let us drink to the memory of Valyria. May the Seven guide us if we decide to remind the world that a Baratheon does not fear shadows. Little did Robert know, in that moment, that he stood upon the precipice of decisions that would rattle the foundations of the realm. Some claimed later that it was in that very hall, as the crowd cheered and the king's next toast rang out, that ghosts from Valyria whispered among the rafters, smiling at the mortal folly that would soon invite them back into the world. In the weeks that followed, Robert summoned his council to discuss the idea more thoroughly. They convened in the Tower of the Hand, as the small council chamber proved too cramped for the number of lords present. Robert wanted them all to hear the plan so that when he gave his edict, none could claim ignorance. Eddard was there, so was Stannis, Renly, Pycelle, Varys, Littlefinger, and Ser Barristan Selmy, along with a smattering of other highborn men with knowledge of ships or ancient lore. Tywin Lannister had politely declined to attend, claiming pressing business in Casterly Rock. Cersei lurked at the edges, radiant in green velvet, but silent. Robert stood before a table strewn with parchment. The candles cast flickering shadows on the curved walls of the tower, dancing shapes that seemed to hint at hidden presences. A gust from the open window rustled the parchment, scrawled with half-finished sketches of sails and the silhouettes of ominous mountains. At length, Robert leaned over and set a large, iron-studded finger on the map. We sail from Dragonstone, he said. Since it's the nearest port of the Crown to the Valyrian Peninsula, we will chart a route that hugs the coastlines where possible, though we'll have to cross open water eventually. Old maps show that the smoking sea is ringed by volcanoes, but it isn't an endless labyrinth. The Targaryens fled from there, did they not? So there must have been navigable waters once. Stannis folded his arms. Yes, once, but centuries have passed, and the cataclysm changed the face of the region. Anyone who's ventured near speaks of geysers of molten stone that erupt unpredictably, and pockets of toxic vapors. The water can boil, or so the sailors say. Robert grunted. We'll go prepared. We'll bring wise men, and Pycelle can gather alchemists if need be. We'll keep a respectable distance from anything that smells of rotten eggs. We're not going to be reckless. Renly's eyes danced with curiosity. And once we reach Valyria, dear brother, what do we do? Plant a crown on the nearest chunk of blackened rock? Or do we intend to build a new seat of the Empire? Robert glowered at Renly for the mockery in his voice, but answered anyway. We explore. We see what remains. If we can find relics or forges that still function, Valyrian steel is valuable beyond measure. If there is land stable enough, perhaps we set up an outpost. We'll show the world that the Seven Kingdoms has the might to go where others dare not. Let us claim the wealth that still lies hidden. Varys's soft voice slid into the conversation. Your Grace, Rumors hold that the land itself is cursed, not simply by the memory of the cataclysm, but by sorceries left behind. The Targaryens themselves avoided returning, though it was the seat of their ancestors' power. Might that not counsel caution? Robert shrugged. Brash. So the Targaryens were too timid to reclaim their homeland. They built their seat on Dragonstone. That was their choice. I am not a Targaryen, thank the gods. Let the black magic prattle remain in the taverns. We are men of flesh and blood, not frightened children. The realm needs a show of force, a unifying project, something to remind them that King Robert Baratheon isn't just a drunk who sits on his throne. Let us gather a fleet. Stannis, you command it. Barristan Selmy, you lead the knights. Ned, you oversee the supply lines. We'll have lords pledge men and ships. A grand expedition. Let the small folk cheer us as we embark. And when we return, we will bring back wonders never before seen in living memory. At that, there was little more for the council to do except exchange glances. The king's mind was set, and when Robert Baratheon decided on a course of action, he was like an avalanche. Pycelle sputtered something about the cost, but Littlefinger licked his lips and assured them the crown could manage it with a few new loans and taxes. So the gears began to turn. Ravens flew across the realm, summoning lesser lords to King's Landing. Shipbuilders toiled night and day in the royal yards. The city buzzed with gossip. Some whispered that the king's folly would bring destruction. Others boasted that, with Valyrian steel for every lord's sword, the 7 kingdoms would be invincible. Through it all, Robert roared and feasted, already celebrating the greatness of his upcoming quest. Months passed as the expedition gathered in Dragonstone, the old Targaryen stronghold. The irony of staging from that ancient seat was not lost on the lords who arrived by the day. Soldiers set up camps along the rocky shore. Carts laden with steel and provisions wound their way through the fortress gates. Maesters huddled in corners, studying any scrap of knowledge about Valyria they could find. They paid especially close attention to dire warnings. Plagues, volcanic eruptions, and rumored guardians of the ruins, lizard-like creatures, or even half-breed dragons. Ned Stark spent his days ensuring the supply lines were well organized, though his heart was not in it. He remembered the days of Robert's rebellion, how they had fought a righteous war to unseat a mad king. Now, he felt the creeping sense that they were about to do something equally mad, only this time at Robert's behest. Yet Ned's loyalty bound him. He tried to remind the king quietly, in private, that the North needed him, that winter might be coming, that the realm's gold was better spent on roads and fortifications. Robert only slapped him on the back and assured him that once they returned with spoils from Valyria, the realm would be flush with wealth. "You'll see, Ned," he said. "This will be the greatest victory since the Field of Fire." Meanwhile, Stannis presided over the sailors. His jaw remained perpetually clenched as he worked out the navigational details. He studied old charts, cross-referenced them with travelers' accounts, and had outbursts of frustration as he discovered they contradicted each other. The smoking sea, it seemed, was a labyrinth of hazards that shifted unpredictably. But Stannis would not rest until he mapped as safe a route as possible. He assigned loyal sea captains, tested them on their knowledge, and made sure the royal fleet would be the best prepared for uncharted waters. Barristan Selmy, the old knight of renown, found himself training young squires and knights who had volunteered for the expedition. He saw a flicker of the same youthful eagerness he once had when he served under the Targaryens, but it was tempered by a sense of dread. Barristan was no stranger to risk, but he felt in his bones that they meddled in something beyond mortal ken. Still, the Kingsguard vow demanded loyalty. If Robert was set on this path, Barristan would see it through and protect him to the best of his ability. Renly, for his part, made a game of it. He dazzled the young knights with stories of the wonders they would find, secured new alliances among those less certain, and generally turned the expedition into a great adventure. He teased that when they returned, they might rename King's Landing to Valyrian's Landing in Robert's honor. Many laughed, though some only half-heartedly. Away from the bustle, in a quiet corridor of Dragonstone's labyrinthine keep, Cersei confronted Robert. She cornered him after a day of planning with the lords, her green eyes flashing with a cold, imperious light. "You mean to leave the capital for how long?" she demanded. Robert's face was ruddy from the day's exertions and the wine he had drunk at supper. "As long as it takes. A few months, maybe longer if the weather is foul. I will not be deterred by trifles." "How can you be so cavalier? You are the king. If you sail off, the realm will be left in the hands of what? A council? Or me? You have never trusted me with real governance." She pressed her lips together, waiting for his reply. He fixed her with a hard stare. "You'll remain in King's Landing. You'll preside over the court. Ned or someone else I trust will ensure the city doesn't collapse under your watch. If Tywin can be convinced to remain in the capital, all the better, though I expect he'll prefer to be at the Rock. Don't worry your pretty head. There's no war to fight. The realm won't need me to quell rebellions for a while. We're only now finishing the last of them." She inhaled sharply. "Why do this, Robert? There is no sense in it. Let the free cities or some Essosi merchant lords chase these fancies. Westeros is ours. Secure it." A flicker of the old anger sparked in his eyes. "That's the difference between you and me, woman. I didn't take the throne to become a jailer to my own realm. I will not sit idly. This is my chance to seize something grand. And if you don't understand, that's your failing, not mine." He left her then, the echo of his boots on stone marking the final word. She stared after him, trembling with an emotion that was part fury, part fear. In her heart, she wondered whether Robert might indeed return with a new power to overshadow House Lannister. Or perhaps, she brooded, he would not return at all. She found that thought not entirely unwelcome, though she kept such treachery hidden behind a mask of regal disdain. The day of departure arrived with a gray dawn that turned the sea to dull metal. A grand procession of banners fluttered in the breeze at Dragonstone's docks. The golden stag of House Baratheon, the dire wolf of Stark, the golden rose of Tyrell, the falcon of Arryn, and a scattering of lesser houses. Most lords had sent contingents in the hope of earning royal favor, or, at the very least, to keep an eye on the king's mad venture. Robert himself wore polished armor with a stag's head embossed on the breastplate, though he left his massive antlered helm for a squire to carry. He stood at the quay, hammer in one hand, waiting. The wind whipped his black hair, shot with the first streaks of gray. He looked more alive than he had in years. They boarded a flagship christened Storm's Majesty, a massive warship with triple masts and a reinforced hull. Stannis boarded his own ship, the Fury, to lead the rest of the fleet. Behind them, hundreds of ships stretched across the harbor, a veritable armada. Most bore the royal stag or the crowned staglion that denoted the king's personal standard, though some still flew their house banners. The ships carried knights, archers, sailors, and provisions enough for many months. A crowd of small folk, tradesmen, and curious onlookers gathered to watch them depart. Some cheered, others muttered that this was the last they would see of the king. With a blast of horns and a shuffle of sails, the fleet departed Dragonstone's craggy port, heading east and south. The day remained overcast, the gulls screaming overhead, as if warning them not to venture onward. It took weeks to reach the waters just west of the Jade Sea. On the approach, they began to sense something amiss. The air grew thick, charged with a faint sulfuric smell that clung to their clothes. Clouds often boiled in the distance, dark and violent, lit from within by fleeting flashes of orange. Crewmen whispered of sea serpents and ghosts. Sailors who had grown up in the Stepstones muttered that this region of water was different, unnatural. Robert dismissed the talk with laughter, but he drank more at night and seemed restless. One evening, Ned Stark and Barristan Selmy joined Robert on the aft castle of Storm's Majesty. A pale moon hung in a swirling sky. Below them, the black water churned. It was quieter than normal, as if the living sea held its breath. Ned looked out at the flicker of lights in the distance. Stannis's Fury signaled with lanterns that they would adjust course to avoid a patch of rocky shoals. Overhead, the sails creaked ominously. "You feel it too, do you not?" Barristan asked softly. He had a solemn look on his lined face. Ned nodded. Aye, it's like the calm before a storm. But more than that. Robert set down his pewter cup, the contents sloshing. Enough gloom, you two. We're nearing Valyria. If the place were a day's sail from King's Landing, it wouldn't be so damned legendary, would it? No one answered. The wind made its lonely cry. Robert, uncharacteristically, did not press them. Something in the atmosphere, some intangible pressure, weighed on the conversation. Eventually, they all retired to their cabins, the taste of dread on their tongues. In the days that followed, the skies darkened. The fleet sailed into waters that seemed alive with steam and drifting banks of foul-smelling mist. They saw rocky outcroppings that glowed red in places, as if molten rock pulsed just beneath the crust. The wind howled strangely, echoing like the moan of monstrous throats. Men coughed, for the air stung their lungs, and a few sailors took ill with fevers. Maesters tended them and tried to keep morale from breaking. Stannis was unrelenting in his discipline. Through signals and boat transfers, he barked orders to keep the ships in formation, to avoid hazards. Many men praised his leadership, saying that without his iron will, they might have floundered in confusion. Eventually, on a day when the sky was streaked with a sickly yellow haze, lookouts on the leading ships cried out. Shapes loomed on the horizon. Black spires, melted towers, the silhouette of a broken city. The wreckage of Valyria rose from the sea like a twisted labyrinth of black stone, half-sunken and draped in ash. A hush fell over the fleet as they beheld it. A place older than memory, once the greatest city in the known world, now reduced to a cracked and decaying nightmare. The water hissed along their hulls as they ventured closer. The entire area smelled of brimstone. Some ships kept a wide berth, too frightened to near the edges of the crumbling wharves. Robert refused to hold back. He commanded Storm's Majesty to drop anchor at a jagged docking structure that might once have been a proud pier. The rock was slick with algae and black glass, but they managed to throw ropes. One by one, other ships followed suit. Knights, men-at-arms, and explorers disembarked. The first step onto Valyrian soil was eerie, felt hot to the touch. Men shifted uncomfortably in their boots. A haze lay over the broken streets. Whole blocks of black stone buildings slumped at odd angles. Some looked as though they had partially melted, as if subjected to unimaginable heat. Spires jutted up from the gloom, sometimes leaning against each other, covered in ash. The sky overhead churned, half smothered by swirling smoke from distant volcanoes. Robert walked among his troops, hammer in hand, a determined scowl on his face. "Look at this place," he muttered. "It's like stepping into a demon's dream." Yet for all his bravado, even he did not bellow as loudly as before. The oppressive atmosphere demanded caution. He gestured for Baratheon and the knights to form a perimeter. "We make camp by the shore for now. Send out patrols to see if there's any stable ground farther inland." Maesters and alchemists hurried to take samples of the weird, porous rock, marveling at the architecture. Soldiers coughed in the fumes. Everywhere they looked, they saw collapsed arches and statues worn down to stumps. Sometimes, a vaguely humanoid shape stood out in the gloom, half hidden by fallen masonry. Men approached with caution, only to find it was a melted statue or a carving so detailed it appeared alive. They discovered a broad avenue leading inland, flanked by once proud pillars now scorched black. At intervals, petrified remains of something reptilian littered the way, possibly the skeleton of a small dragon, or some cousin of dragons that once roamed the city. Wind through the crumbled towers sounded like the low moan of ghosts. The men in the patrols shared uneasy glances. Some muttered prayers to the Seven. Others clutched stags or wolf heads or flowers carved from weirwood, any token of protection they had brought. After they established a rudimentary beachhead, Robert and his key advisors ventured deeper into the ruins. They rode lightly armed, for the ground was treacherous and the illusions of shape and shadow abounded. Ned Stark, Renly Baratheon, Barristan Selmy, a few knights, and some volunteer lords accompanied the king. They passed half-buried structures that might have been mansions or temples. The stench of sulfur grew stronger, and once a tremor shook the ground. Far off, they heard a rumbling, followed by a dull roar, as if one of the distant volcanoes had vented its fury. They came upon a great plaza, open to the roiling sky. At its center stood the remnants of a colossal statue, a dragon's body carved from black stone, its wings snapped off, its head missing. Around the edges of the plaza, half-fallen columns suggested a grand forum in ages past. Robert's party dismounted, carefully picking their way over cracked pavement. There, they beheld something that made them all pause. Faint lines etched into the ground, forming a glyph or sigil none of them recognized. The pattern resembled twisting dragon tails coiling around a fiery sun. Renly whistled low under his breath. Quite the mosaic. Perhaps once it was inlaid with gold or gem shards. He crouched down to touch it, but Ned grabbed his wrist. "Best not," Ned said. "We don't know what power it might hold." He couldn't explain why, but the place gave him a chill, as though eyes watched from every corner, unseen. Robert stared at the design, then spat. Superstitious nonsense. They had fancy ways of carving their floors, that's all. Yet even his voice seemed subdued. He set his hand on his hammer's pommel, as if reassuring himself of its heft. "We should bring the maesters here, let them scribble their notes. Then we'll tear up the ground and see if there's anything to salvage. If the gods are kind, we'll find a storehouse of Valyrian steel somewhere in these ruins." Baratheon surveyed the dilapidated buildings circling the plaza. "No sign of life," he murmured. "But it feels like something is lurking. Could be my imagination." They explored a bit more, but found only warped columns, melted doorways, and choking ash. The heat pressed down upon them, so they returned to the shore camp, where the men had erected tents. Fires were lit, though the smoke mingled with the ever-present vapors and made breathing difficult. That evening, thunder rumbled in the distance. The sea glowed a faint red from volcanic reflections. Soldiers huddled around fires, telling each other tales of wraiths. Some dozed fitfully, haunted by nightmares. Others took uneasy watches, scanning the black horizon. On the command ship, the Fury, Stannis remained, coordinating the rest of the fleet's anchorage and ensuring no storm or swirling current dashed them against the rocks. Before dawn, something stirred in the darkness. A faint tremor rocked the shoreline, and those who stood guard swore they glimpsed pale shapes flickering among the half-sunken ruins. A knight raised a lantern, but saw nothing, yet the feeling of being watched persisted. When morning came, tinted with a sickly orange hue from the volcanic clouds, a group of explorers led by Lord Celtigar, an eager man with a taste for lost treasures, decided to push farther inland. They ventured across the city's broken avenues, half afloat in swampy water from the countless cracks that let the sea in. Their torches struggled against the swirling mists that drifted from vents in the ground. Hours passed, and only half of them returned to the shore camp. The survivors stumbled in, eyes wild, babbling about grotesque silhouettes flitting through the gloom, and sudden sinkholes that swallowed men whole. Lord Celtigar was missing. One of the returning soldiers stammered that they had found a shaft leading underground, lined with carvings of dragons. The group had heard what sounded like moaning winds from below. They proceeded, hoping for treasure, but something caused the floor to collapse beneath them. Celtigar and several men fell into an unseen pit. The survivors fled in panic, hearing strange hisses and scuttling sounds from the darkness. Their faces were pale with terror, and they refused to return. Word reached Robert, who frowned and chewed on his beard. "Celtigar was a fool," he said. "We can't be deterred by one misfortune. We must be more careful. Send a properly equipped party with rope and picks. We can't lose more men to collapsed floors." The tragedy dampened the enthusiasm of many. A few lords murmured about turning back, but Robert would hear no talk of retreat. "We've come this far," he insisted. "At least let us find something of worth." So the forays continued, if more cautiously. Deeper in the city, explorers found the remnants of a forge complex. The walls had partially caved in, but in the warped remains of metal tables, they saw what might once have been tools of Valyrian steelworking. Much was rusted or melted beyond recognition. However, near the rear of the complex stood a sealed iron door, etched with runes. Its surface, though old, had resisted the decay that claimed everything else. 2 knights tried to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. A blacksmith was summoned. He hammered at the lock, and the ring of metal on metal echoed with a strangely harmonic resonance that made onlookers shudder. Then, without warning, the door slid open with a harsh groan, as though it had waited for the correct blow. Inside the hidden chamber they found racks and stands. Most were empty or held lumps of corroded metal. But on a central dais sat a slender sword, black and shining, that seemed untouched by time. The men gasped. Was it truly Valyrian steel? Its pommel bore a ruby carved in the shape of a dragon's eye, and the blade shimmered with dark ripples in the dim light. One knight reached out to touch the sword's handle, and for a moment, he cried out, as if a static shock had jolted him. Then he clutched it in his fist, his eyes lit with awe. "It's so light," he whispered, "but strong. I can feel it." When Robert arrived to see the find, his face broke into a grin. "At last, Valyrian steel, by the gods. Let's see if there's more." But they found only the single blade. Robert examined it, ran his thumb along the edge, and let out a marveling sound when he saw it slice into his skin almost without resistance. Blood beaded on his thumb. "Hells," he muttered, stepping back. "This is the real thing, no doubt." He looked around, half expecting to find a hidden arsenal. Instead, they found only the one sword, set there like an offering or a lure. In the following days, the men discovered a few other artifacts. A tarnished crown of black metal in a collapsed vault, shards of carved dragon bone, and a twisted scepter that might once have been adorned with gem dragons' heads. Many items were broken or corroded, yet each find rekindled the king's determination, reminding him that true wealth and wonders lay concealed in these haunted ruins. Meanwhile, the camp at the shore grew restless. Men fell ill with more frequency. Fevers ran high. The maesters toiled night and day to treat them, but a creeping sense of dread pervaded the tents. At night, some swore they heard chanting from afar, in a language none recognized. A few even claimed to see glimmers of firelight dancing on the edges of the city, as if other inhabitants roamed the labyrinth of black stone. When scouts ventured in that direction, they found no living soul, only shadows and ash. Morale declined, discipline wavered. Robert responded by ordering an increased watch, doubling the guard on each post, to keep men feeling safe. But doubt gnawed at even the bravest hearts. One gray morning, as the king inspected a newly returned search party, a rider came galloping up from the docks. His face was ashen, eyes wide with alarm. "Your Grace, Ser Stannis' flagship, something has happened." Robert barked at the man to explain. The rider gasped. "A few hours ago, we saw strange lights on the Fury, then smoke. Now, there's talk that some men have died, and Ser Stannis is calling for you." Robert wasted no time. He, Ned, Baratheon, and a handful of knights hurried back to the shore, boarded a longboat, and rowed to where the Fury sat anchored. The crew that greeted them looked shaken. Stannis met Robert on the deck, face grim as ever, but with a haunted edge that the king had never seen in his brother's eyes. Bodies lay covered with cloaks near the mainmast, at least 3 or 4. The smell of burnt flesh mingled with the already foul air. Stannis explained in clipped tones. "Last night, the men on watch saw a figure creeping below deck. They pursued it. The intruder seemed not human. Its face was blackened, cracked like old stone, eyes glowing red. Some trick of the lanterns, perhaps. They cornered it near the cargo hold. One man tried to seize it, and he was set ablaze. Spontaneously, no torch or wildfire was present. The rest fought to subdue the creature. By the time I arrived, it had vanished into the darkness, leaving these 4 men dead, burned from the inside, almost. We searched the ship from stem to stern but found no trace. It's as if it dissolved into smoke." Robert's anger flared. though it was tinted with fear. "You let it escape?" he demanded. Stannis clenched his jaw. "It was no normal foe. I do not know if it stowed away from the city or swam across the cursed waters. The men are terrified." Ned spoke quietly, crossing himself. "I've never heard such a tale. Could it be some spirit? Or a demon conjured by the sorceries of old Valyria?" Robert ground his teeth. "I don't believe in demons," he said, but the unsteadiness in his voice betrayed him. He looked at the corpses. The stench of charred flesh made his stomach churn. "We must purge the fleet and the camp to ensure no such thing is skulking around. Perhaps it's a diseased wretch who set a fire. Let's not succumb to children's stories." Stannis said nothing, only stared at the black water lapping against the hull. The rest of the day was spent in a frantic search of every ship. Men brandished torches, combing every hold and cargo area. They found no intruder, no sign of the terrifying figure. Some whispered that it was a shadow of Valyria itself, wrathful that mortals dared trespass. Others insisted it was a spy from the Shadowlands beyond Ashai. However, speculation offered no solace to the grieving families of the dead. When Robert returned to shore, he found the men there equally unnerved. Whispers spread that a monster roamed the city's ruins. Patrols reported seeing flickers of motion in the corners of their vision. Always, when they turned to look, there was nothing. Tensions rose. The king ordered more frequent patrols and demanded that the search for treasures continue. That night, under the uneasy glow of the volcanic sky, the expedition's leaders gathered in Robert's pavilion for council. Robert sat at the head of a crude table. Stannis stood by his shoulder, arms folded. Ned and Barristan sat opposite each other. Renly lounged on a stool, though his usual mirth was absent. A handful of other lords lingered near the edges, all wearing anxious expressions. The candle flames danced, throwing shifting shadows on the tent walls. "This land is cursed," said one lord with trembling hands. "Your Grace, we should withdraw. There's no point in losing more men to this madness." "Madness," Robert barked, rising. "We have found Valyrian steel. We have glimpses of wonders untold. And you call it madness? So a few men died. Men die every day. We are close to a true triumph. We can't give up at the first sign of trouble." His words rang hollow, for the entire expedition had been riddled with ill omens and strange occurrences, not just one sign. Renly cleared his throat. "Brother, it is not just a first sign of trouble. We've lost many men, and the morale is collapsing. Another incident like the one on the Fury, and we could have a mutiny. Listen to the men, they are terrified." Stannis spoke quietly. "We have not found any hoard of steel. One sword, a few trinkets. The cost is growing. And I sense this city is not finished with us yet." Robert glared at his brother. "You too, Stannis? I expect caution from you, but not fear." Stannis's eyes flashed with anger, but he kept his tone measured. "Fear is wise sometimes. The men are exhausted, sick. If we are to remain, we must do so with a sound plan. We can't simply blunder around these ruins chasing apparitions." Ned ventured to speak. "Robert, what if we just take what we have, some small measure of success, and depart? We could return with more knowledge, better preparations." Robert stared at him, and for a moment, Ned saw something like desperation flicker in his friend's gaze. A man haunted by regrets, by the ghosts of his past glories. Then Robert scowled and slammed his fist on the table. "Fine," he said. "We regroup. We give it a few more days. See if we can uncover anything truly worthwhile. Then we leave. But by the gods, I won't run out of here like a whipped dog. We make one last strong push." Most around the table accepted this as a compromise. They would gather a large, well-armed force and delve into the city's interior, ensuring no passage was left unexplored. If the men found nothing of great consequence, so be it. They would depart. It seemed an arrangement that spared Robert's pride and eased some of the Lord's fears. At dawn, they mustered 200 knights and men-at-arms, plus scouts and maesters. Robert led them in person, riding at the front with Barristan and Ned flanking him. Behind came the swirl of house banners, though the colors seemed muted by the ashen sky. They moved through the ruins with a deliberate pace, prodding the ground to avoid sinkholes, scattering in small teams to search any building that looked intact. The king insisted on being in the vanguard, ignoring the counsel that he stay behind. The deeper they traveled, the more uncanny the city became. Streets ended in collapsed ravines that glowed faintly with molten rock far below. Strange crystals jutted out from fissures, humming with a faint resonance if struck. Ruined towers leaned precariously, connected by collapsed arches. Occasionally, they heard the distant hiss or roar of some unseen vent spewing steam. The air grew thick and hot, stinging the eyes. As they passed an ancient colonnade, the men in the front ranks paused. Something moved among the columns. Figures tall, gaunt silhouettes. They flickered, as if illusions cast by heat haze, then disappeared. The knights braced, shields up, swords drawn. A hush fell over the column of men. Robert frowned. "Show yourselves," he bellowed. His voice echoed back mockingly from the stone. They advanced step by step. The columns formed a corridor leading to a large antechamber of some once grand building. Ornate carvings of dragons soared overhead. Amid the gloom, a swirling shape of darkness coalesced. For an instant, it seemed a man in black robes stood there. Then it rippled, and the shape was gone. A chill wind blew, though the air had been hot moments before. Barristan guided the men to form a defensive line. Ned's heart pounded as he peered into the gloom, half expecting an army of wights or demons. But nothing lunged at them. The building was empty save for echoes. A few men muttered prayers. Robert spat on the ground, trying to mask his unease. Pressing forward, they discovered a grand hall lined with massive stone tablets, each inscribed with ancient Valyrian glyphs. Some of the tablets were shattered or melted, but others remained legible, at least to those who could read Valyrian script. The maesters and scribes hurried to make rubbings. The temperature seemed to plummet. Their breath fogged in the air, an impossibility given the outside heat. The hall was suffused with an otherworldly chill. Some men's teeth began chattering. Robert rubbed his arms, muttering curses. One of the maesters, an older man named Jacelyn, managed to decipher a few lines. He muttered aloud, "Blood, fire, binding, the conjuration of draconic essence. Something about forging a link between flesh and flame. This is sorcery, your grace, from the heights of Valyrian power. Perhaps the forging of Valyrian steel involved blood magic." Robert growled, "We've always heard rumors of that, so this is proof." Jacelyn nodded shakily. "It appears so. He stopped mid-sentence, eyes going wide. The lines he was reading seemed to shift on the stone. He gasped, stepping back as if struck. Ned rushed forward, catching the old man before he collapsed. "Maester!" The older man's eyes rolled back in his head. A faint greenish glow flickered across the inscriptions, like ghostly flame dancing on the stone. Many men exclaimed in alarm. Some knights swore the carvings changed shape right before their eyes. Others claimed it was only a trick of the gloom and their imaginations. Barristan and Robert both saw enough to raise their weapons. "We leave," Robert barked, helping Ned carry the stricken maester. "You men seal this place behind us. We'll have no more of this. I won't risk lives for black magic." A handful of strong men heaved the heavy remnants of columns and debris to block the entrance as they left. The group hastened back into the labyrinth of streets, uneasy. They had found knowledge, perhaps, but at what cost? The chill lingered, though the midday heat battered them from above. The men no longer marched in neat formation. Fear frayed their discipline. Suddenly, a shriek echoed from a side alley. One patrol had fallen behind. Now they came sprinting into view, faces contorted in terror. "Run! Run!" they yelled. Behind them, a swirling shape coalesced, black as pitch, vaguely humanoid. It seemed to seethe with ribbons of darkness that spiraled around a core of burning orange. One soldier stumbled, and the shape loomed over him. In an instant, he ignited into flames, screaming as the shadow pressed a claw-like appendage against his chest. Chaos erupted. Knights roared, forming a line to charge. But how does one fight a living shadow? Weapons passed through it, and it retaliated with lances of searing heat. Another man was set ablaze, flailing in agony. The stench of burning flesh filled the air. Baratheon, forging ahead, managed to strike at the entity with a sword covered in oil from a broken lantern, the blade ablaze. For a brief moment, the shadow recoiled from the flame, letting out a soundless wail that chilled the blood. Then it dissolved into black motes, scattering on the wind. The men stood panting, half in shock. The soldier who had burned lay charred and lifeless. Others bore singed armor or scorched limbs. Robert gritted his teeth, horror plain on his face. "Gods have mercy," he whispered, hammer trembling in his grasp. That was the moment Ned Stark realized that his friend, the fearless Robert Baratheon, had finally encountered a terror he did not know how to conquer with muscle alone. They wasted no more time. The entire formation turned and rushed back toward the shoreline. The city seemed to resist their retreat, twisting the streets with fresh rubble and tangles of collapsed stone. Some swore the ground shifted beneath their feet, forcing them down unfamiliar alleyways. Strange whispers teased their ears. The columns overhead looked like monstrous shapes. Several men lost their nerve and sprinted in random directions, only to vanish in the swirling mists. Others banded together around the king, forming a defensive knot. Every so often, the flicker of that shadowy entity appeared again, or perhaps multiple entities. The group staved them off with torches, furious sword swings, desperate prayers to the Seven, and in one instance, a burst of wildfire from a pot an alchemist carried. The shadows hissed and scattered, but not without claiming more lives. When at last they reached the outskirts of the city, the relief was palpable. They saw the glimmer of the sea, the anchored ships. Tents lined the beach. Men gasped, half collapsing on the sand. Robert barked at them to rise. "No time to rest," he said, voice quavering with equal parts rage and fear. "We're leaving, all of us, now." No one argued. Runners were sent to spread the word to break camp immediately. Soldiers scrambled to gather what supplies they could. The wounded were carried onto boats. The corpses of those who had fallen to disease or the city's horrors were abandoned or given hasty funerals by burning pyres at the water's edge. For no one wished to bring potential curses onto the ships. Stannis, upon hearing the report, gave a curt nod, then began organizing the fleet for immediate departure. It was no simple task. Crews needed to weigh anchor, coordinate so they wouldn't collide in the cramped waters, and navigate the swirling currents and volcanic hazards. But the presence of terror fueled them to move faster than ever. In the midst of this frantic exodus, Robert paced along the shore, barking orders at the men to hurry. Ned and Baratheon joined him, trying to keep the retreat orderly. Renly supervised the loading of knights onto smaller boats, though his usual breezy demeanor had vanished entirely, replaced by grim efficiency. The men's faces were pale, their eyes darting around as if the shadows of the city might leap upon them at any moment. Some of the items they had collected, old tomes, relics, the single Valyrian steel sword, the black crown, were hastily loaded onto the ships. The king demanded that they keep those spoils at all costs, as they were the only justification for this hellish expedition. Onlookers eyed the relics warily, suspecting them of carrying curses. But no one disobeyed the king's command. Fearful or not, they would not cross Robert Baratheon. As the final boat pushed off from the shore, Robert was among those aboard, scowling at the city's silhouette through the acrid haze. In the distance, faint lights glimmered, as though mocking them. It was daytime, yet the ashen sky and drifting fog made it look like perpetual twilight. The city's spires seemed to ripple, half real, half hallucination. No one felt safe until they were on the deck of their respective ships, sails unfurled, catching what wind they could. The fleet maneuvered carefully around steaming vents and molten flows that spilled into the sea. Robert stood by the prow of Storm's Majesty, fists clenched at the rail, watching Valyria recede. He refused to speak. Those near him could almost see the storm inside him raging. Frustration, shame, relief at escaping with his life, and anger that his bold dream had turned to horror. The voyage back should have been easier, but the smoking sea did not relinquish them readily. Storms assailed the fleet, swirling with unnatural fury. Stannis directed them around the worst of it, yet several ships fell behind or were capsized by monstrous waves. Streaks of lightning cut across the broiling sky, and thunder rumbled like the wrath of the old gods. Men shivered, praying to the Seven, the drowned god, the old gods, any deity who might guide them safely through this cursed domain. Days turned to weeks as they slowly made their way to calmer waters. The men grew haggard. Supplies ran low. Illness spread among the crews. Some delirious sailors leaped overboard, convinced they were fleeing nightmares that haunted their dreams. The king's fleet was a shadow of its former proud self. Yet at long last, they reached the familiar seas near the stepstones. The storms abated. The sky lightened to a more natural tone of gray. One by one, battered ships limped to port at Dragonstone or Driftmark, many missing masts or sails, entire decks smashed by the savage storms. Robert Storm's Majesty was among the first to arrive. The king disembarked in silence. He looked older, drained. His eyes darted, as if searching for hidden threats even on the familiar docks. Eddard Stark and Barristan Selmy accompanied him, both equally grim. Renly stepped off the plank, letting out a long sigh as his boots touched solid ground. Stannis's Fury docked soon after, though missing half its rigging. The Lord of Dragonstone himself looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and found it stared back. Slowly, the battered remains of the expedition returned to King's Landing. Word of their homecoming spread like wildfire through the city. But there was no triumphant parade, no grand boisterous feast. The small folk saw haggard men disembark, wearing ragged armor and haunted expressions. They noted the missing ships, the burned or wounded men carried on litters. It did not resemble a victorious king's return. In the Red Keep, Cersei watched them from a balcony. She did not rush to greet her husband. Instead, she merely gazed with a mixture of cold satisfaction and apprehension, for she saw that Robert was alive, yet changed. She sensed a calamity unspoken in the lines of his face. If she harbored any illusions that the expedition would solve all of the crown's woes, they vanished at the sight of the returning men. Robert had the relics placed under lock and key in the dungeons beneath the Red Keep. He forbade anyone from studying them too closely, except for a select group of maesters. "Keep them away from me," he snarled when they asked for his leave to examine them for knowledge. The black sword was placed in a sealed chest, lined with velvet. The black crown and the twisted scepter lay next to it. Some said at night they heard faint humming from that chamber. Others scoffed at the rumor. King Robert Baratheon, once the jovial warrior, was now sullen, prone to long silences and violent outbursts. He drank even more heavily than before. He left much of the governance to the small council, ignoring the realm's pressing issues. The cost of the expedition and the additional loans weighed on the treasury like a millstone. Some lords began to grumble openly that the king had wasted the realm's wealth on a mad dream, returning only with curses and nightmares. As for the men who had traveled to Valyria, many suffered nightmares. Some woke screaming in the night, claiming they saw shadowy shapes at the foot of their beds. Others reported that their reflections seemed distorted, like something else peered from behind their own eyes. The Red Keep's halls rang with frightened whispers. A sense of unease pervaded the seat of power. The city itself felt it. A tension crackled in the air, as though the unnatural storms of the smoking sea had followed them home. Then, one fateful night, months after their return, the king stirred from his cups to find his way to the dungeons. Perhaps it was curiosity or some twisted compulsion. He ordered the guards aside and demanded they open the vault where the Valyrian relics were kept. The jailers hesitated but could not refuse their king. The iron door creaked open, revealing the chest in the flickering torchlight. Robert approached, heart pounding. A part of him wanted to fling the cursed objects into Blackwater Bay. Another part of him felt drawn, as though hearing a siren call. He lifted the lid. The black sword gleamed, that single ruby eye in its pommel seeming to stare at him. The black crown rested next to it, shaped into a ring of twisted metal resembling interlocking dragon claws. Robert recalled the legends. Valyrian lords wore crowns like these, imbued with power. He snorted at the notion, but found himself lifting the crown, studying the dark curves that glistened in the torchlight. "Damn you," he muttered, remembering how he had lost good men to obtain it, how the nightmares still haunted him. The ruby ford, the trident, the warhammer. His old glory seemed distant now, overshadowed by the black shadows he had encountered. He turned to the sword, gently touching its hilt. He could almost feel it vibrating under his palm, a living thing. The hair on his arms stood on end. He took a deep breath, then seized the sword. First, nothing happened. Then a faint whisper reached his ears. Or was it only the wind through the dungeon corridors? The rubied pommel gleamed a little brighter. He slammed the chest shut and barked at the guards to close the vault. They complied hastily, unsettled by the king's strange manner. Robert stalked away through the damp corridors, the black sword at his side. When he reached his chambers, he locked himself in. That night, no one saw him emerge. The next morning, he reappeared, eyes bloodshot, face pale. He said not a word, striding to the throne room with the sword strapped to his belt. The courtiers gasped at the sight. The king had always favored his warhammer or a simpler blade, never something so ominous. But no one dared question him. Time passed. Whispers spread among the court that the king was behaving erratically. Some nights he would be found pacing the halls, muttering. Other times he would lash out at courtiers, striking them or demanding bizarre tasks, as if some half-hidden madness gnawed at him or a power tugged at his mind. Eddard Stark, troubled by these rumors, confronted Robert in private, urging him to discard the sword. Robert roared at him, outraged, and threatened to have him removed from court if he persisted. Ned left the throne room, wounded and dismayed. In the small council, arguments raged about how to address the king's behavior. Cersei seemed to watch with cold fascination, rarely intervening, perhaps content to see Robert unravel. The realm suffered for it, as lawlessness grew in outlying provinces. Taxes soared to cover the expedition's debt. Famine threatened small folk who found no relief from King's Landing. Then, in the dead of a stormy night, an event happened that would seal the fate of the realm. Lightning lit the towers of the Red Keep, thunder booming like the hammer of the gods. Inside the keep, a handful of guards patrolled the silent corridors. Suddenly, a shriek echoed through the hall near the vaults. Men rushed to investigate and found 2 guards on the ground, lifeless. Their bodies had been burned from the inside out, the flesh blackened. The iron door to the vault stood open again, and from within emerged a flicker of darkness. The terror from Valyria had returned, or perhaps it had never truly left. Some conjuration tied to those relics had manifested again, a swirl of living shadow. The few watchers who saw it that night swore they beheld a shape at once man and dragon, wreathed in black flames that seared the eyes. The creature glided along the corridors, leaving scorch marks on the walls. It made for the upper floors, seemingly drawn to something or someone. Robert Baratheon was in his solar, head pounding, the black sword propped by his side. He looked up at the sound of the thunder. The door burst open. A guard stumbled in, face white. "Your Grace, a demon in the keep." Robert sprang to his feet, sword in hand, the old warrior's reflexes kindling. He might be half in drink, but he was still Robert Baratheon, the Storm Lord once unstoppable on the battlefield. He staggered into the corridor, footsteps echoing on the cold stone. Lightning flashed through a narrow window slit, illuminating the shape approaching. A swirl of black smoke and ember-like eyes. Robert raised the sword, though his heart thundered. He remembered the burning men, the shadows in Valyria. "I am the king," he roared, forcing courage into his voice. "Begone, foul thing." The entity did not speak. It rushed forward, a wave of scorching darkness. Robert swung the black sword. The blade caught the swirling mass, and a shockwave of energy blasted through the corridor. Stones cracked. The guard behind Robert was hurled against the wall. The creature shrieked silently, as if in a clash of raw magic. For a heartbeat it recoiled. Robert felt a surge of triumph. Perhaps the sword carried Valyrian power enough to harm it. But the creature rallied. Tendrils of shadow lashed out, encircling the king's arm. Flames erupted, black and purple in hue. Robert howled in pain, the flesh of his arm blistering. Yet he held onto the sword, driving it forward with all his might. The point glowed with a dark radiance, and the shape dissolved once more into swirling motes, scattering throughout the corridor. A gust of wind swept them away as the windows rattled from the storm. When the swirl had gone, Robert sank to his knees, sweat pouring down his face. His arm was badly burned, the stench of charred skin filling the air. But the demon had vanished, for now. Guards rushed to the king's aid. Maesters were summoned. The sword lay at Robert's side, its ruby pommel dull. Perhaps the creature had not been fully destroyed. Perhaps it had only been banished temporarily. Either way, the damage was done. Word spread that the king had battled a demon in the Red Keep. The small folk whispered that Robert had harnessed some Valyrian magic to defeat it. Others insisted the sword itself was cursed and had invited the demon. Whatever they believed, the fear in the city grew. Men said that the horrors of Valyria had followed the king to King's Landing, that all were doomed. Some even began to flee the city, seeking refuge in the countryside. Robert lingered in his chambers, his burned arm swathed in bandages. The flesh refused to heal properly, weeping with foul-smelling fluids despite the maester's best efforts. Fevers racked him. Sometimes, delirious, he babbled about the shadows, about how Valyria was calling him back. Other times, he wept silently, remembering simpler days as Lord of Storm's End, or a triumphant rebel on the Trident. Ned Stark, who had not returned to Winterfell yet, tried to see him, but was often turned away by the king's fits. When Ned was finally admitted, Robert grabbed his hand with painful strength, eyes blazing. "Promise me, Ned," he gasped. "Promise me you won't let them keep that sword or any of those cursed relics. Destroy them. Send them back to the seven hells where they belong." And then the king passed out again, leaving Ned shaken to his core. In the days that followed, more sightings of flickering shadows were reported. Sometimes near the dungeons, sometimes in dark corners of the Red Keep. An oppressive gloom settled over the castle. Even on clear days, the sun seemed pale. Some lords pressed the king to destroy the Valyrian objects, but Robert, in his fevered state, would refuse or lash out unpredictably. Others suggested they should be taken far away, perhaps to the citadel, but the king's wardens hesitated to cross him. As Robert's health deteriorated, the realm teetered on the edge of chaos. Ambitious lords saw an opportunity to press their claims. The small council bickered. Cersei retreated into her chambers. The peasants whispered that a black curse had fallen upon House Baratheon. If the king died without a stable succession, war might break out. And overshadowing it all was the sense that the secrets of Valyria, awakened by mortal greed, were beginning to stir in the land again. One night, in the black hours just before dawn, Robert Baratheon breathed his last. He died in his bed, drenched in sweat, the stench of his infected burns filling the room. A final lightning flash illuminated his face, twisted by nightmares. The king's passing left the court in an uproar. Cersei declared Joffrey the rightful heir, but many questioned the boy's parentage, fueling old rumors. Stannis, brooding at Dragonstone, claimed the throne by right of blood. Renly, charming and popular, garnered support elsewhere. War brewed in the wings, a civil war that would soon ignite and be remembered as a cataclysm all its own. But in the Red Keep's darkest vault, behind iron doors, the cursed relics of Valyria still lay. Guards swore they heard them hum and pulse at times, a faint heartbeat of unnatural power. Some rumored that on the night Robert died, a swirl of dark smoke coalesced in the corridor outside the vault, as if some presence came to claim the king's soul. Others said that as soon as Robert's heart stopped, the black sword's ruby flickered out, darkening to a lifeless gem. Regardless, the seeds of old, forbidden sorcery had been sown in Westeros, through the king's ill-fated attempt to reclaim the glory of Valyria. And as the realm descended into wars of succession, few realized that the ancient powers of the freehold, awakened from centuries of slumber, might one day stretch their shadows across all the 7 kingdoms. Thus ended the brief, doomed expedition of King Robert Baratheon to Old Valyria. It began as a quest for glory and renown, an act of reckless ambition that he believed would solidify his legacy. Instead, it unleashed horrors best left buried, sowed discord in the heart of the realm, and left a scar upon the land and upon the souls of those who survived. The tragedy of it was whispered in taverns and told by wary sailors for years to come, that in seeking to surpass the Targaryens, King Robert had awakened the black ghosts of Valyria, and by the time he realized the price, it was already too late.